recording now.
Conversation with Dr. JJ and Dr. Desiree Hurtak on the theme of future science.
Great. And if it's all right with you, I'll use first names since you're both Dr. Hurtak, okay?
Right.
JJ for Dr. JJ Hurtak, and Desiree is fine for me.
We both work together as a team, which is why it's so important that we're both on with this conversation.
Great. I love it. And the book needs more women, too, I must say. Okay, let's start with the beginning. Where were you each born, and what kind of family did you grow up in?
Right, we're both from the Midwest. I'm from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. My wife from Chicago. I grew up in the Midwest, attended the University of Minnesota, the University of Chicago, and later the University of California, where I began my academic work. My wife is from Chicago as well as Florida. She spent all of her early life there before
in Florida.
She went to the university.
First I met my husband at California Institute of the Arts, which is in California.
A special school set up by the Disney Corporation, and I was hired by Walt Disney's brother, Roy Disney, to teach science to young actors, actresses, and filmmakers.
He was one of the founding professors at California Institute of the Arts.
In 1970. And that included some of the great minds in music, such as Ravi Shankar, Leonard Bernstein, Andre Previn in music. And I was also on the School of Critical Studies with Beryl Bellman and many of the other leading futurists and thinkers.
And more on the art side, there was Judy Chicago.
I love her.
Yes.
Yeah, she was my colleague.
Oh, wow.
As well as Sheila de Brentville and
other people, actually, some of the students, friends of ours, went on.
Mimi Shapiro. Okay. She was the wife of her husband, famous husband.
Yeah, I wrote about them and interviewed them in my book on women's culture. So they're and I brought them up to Chico for a conference. What month and year were you born in?
Actually, we don't do that. Either of us do that.
What about what astrological sign?
We don't do that.
Well, we think of ourselves as visionaries.
Yes, thank you.
Do you know your Myers-Briggs or Enneagram types?
Well, the Myers-Briggs would be the visionary, idealistic side as opposed to the other. And we would think of our profiles as futurist because we're multidisciplinary and we like to be defined by our intellectual and cultural accomplishments rather than simply by labels, which I think is a throwback to the 60s and 70s. As to the MMPI, the Minnesota Multi-Personality Inventory Studies, I think that this tends to diminish people coming from multicultural backgrounds and those who have, shall we say, different takes on spiritual and consciousness reality by pigeonholing people into categories, which I think is unnecessary in the 21st century.
I get it. I just love categories and labels because it gives me tools in a toolbox. So the more, the better for me.
Like a statistics or something like that. Well, we call ourselves cosmic citizens, and we do place our birthday actually at January 2nd and 3rd, 1973. You can actually find that. And that was when Dr. Hurtak had a unique experience while he was in Northern California.
Well, let's go back to the early childhood. What kind of families were you raised in? What about those families led you to become PhDs and visionaries?
Our parents were of European background in the sense that they had more of a humanistic approach to life, and I, as a young student, was allowed to study a wide variety of religious and cultural philosophies. Of course, that being the case in the Midwest, I acquainted myself with the Judaic, the Christian, even the Buddhistic schools of thought and philosophy, learning the languages and the disciplines necessary to be a scholar in those areas of comparative religion, anthropology, and of course, later the paraphysical and the parapsychological.
But all that when you were in high school?
When I was in high school, I was in accelerated learning programs, and so I was interested very much in learning the ancient languages of what I will call religious text, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek. All of these were in Latin, were important languages for me to use because was drawn to the substance of the spiritual traditions of the Tree of Life and sought to learn basically the linguistic tools and the cultural norms that would be necessary to persevere in these areas.
Right, but both Dr. Hurtak's parents and my parents were not very involved in religious studies, so he could do what he wanted, and they respected that. I thought that was great especially for his era. And I was, of course, the child really of the '60s. So Be Here Now, Yogananda's autobiography. I mean, those things were coming of age, and I read all of them, and I thought that was fantastic as well. And I think it was just that era. My mom was a very strong, she started as Catholic, but she realized that there was so many controls that she didn't want to place those on her kids. And she used to go around and say, you can get divorced if you really need to get divorced. Because back in those generations, because you were Catholic, you couldn't get divorced. And that was like part of her work to be able to do that. And she realized that she had as much connection to the divine and to what she needed to do, as respecting or having to go through some minister at that point.
I should say my first physical awakening took place when I was 16 years of age, and I was reading one of the ancient texts in Hebrew, the text of Ezekiel, and a sphere of light appeared in my room. And I thought this was a good sign that I study religious philosophy. So I began very early to study the ancient texts, both of the Near East and the ancient Far East, and desired really to take a tour of the Middle East and study Coptic, which would throw light onto the missing books of the Bible, the missing scriptures, if you will, that would show a much greater focus on ancient knowledge that shaped Western civilization.
But what languages did you know as an adolescent besides Hebrew?
Just a little bit of German.
And Latin and Greek.
And Latin and Greek.
Yeah.
Okay.
The ancient languages that would give me basically a head start on looking more systematically at the influences of the Near Eastern cultures as opposed to the other world cultures. But again, that turned out to be a bridge to my later studies of Sanskrit in the Oriental traditions. So I have, as you have noted from my publications, several degrees.
So when I met him, actually, he was taking his students to the Self-Realization Fellowship in Los Angeles. We were going to Dr. Thien Nhan, who was a Buddhist scholar, Vietnamese Buddhist scholar, and he had a school that Dr. Hurtak would occasionally teach at. So actually, as a student, he would take his kids, so to speak, or the students, to everywhere around Los Angeles to give them exposure to all the different philosophies.
What were you teaching then, JJ?
I was teaching Eastern philosophy and
that's at Cal Arts.
History, and then I also was teaching simultaneously Near Eastern studies in Egyptology and culture history. So I had two chairs, if you will. I was in anthropology as well as in religion and Oriental studies.
And I always say he was my required course, because when you went to Cal Arts, you took all your art and graphics, and in my case, it was environmental design courses, but then you had to take some of the critical studies. And so him and Beryl Bellman were my two favorite teachers.
I do want to say that as a founding faculty member of California Institute of the Arts, this was a high recognition of the people and the quality that brought, of the Disney Corporation, that brought the leading thinkers and what we would call the visionaries together in the early 70s to shape what they felt would be the direction of modern society.
Yeah, and some of our friends went on to work with Steven Spielberg and others.
Several of my students went on, yes, to do the graphics for Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and others.
He also had Desi Arnaz Jr. as he was attending, so we call him Desi 1 and I'm Desi 2, actually. Liza Minnelli used to come to his class. It was fun to work in Los Angeles.
Oh, yes, that was a good time to be there. I don't hear that kind of creativity from Cal Arts now, maybe just because I'm not tuned in.
Well, the original faculty went its way because just the cutbacks that took place economically in the mid-70s, and everything being what it is, people migrate with age and circumstance. But back to our conversation, I was selected very early on to be a member of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Let me say that again. I was selected to participate at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara, California, that was set up by Robert Hutchins from the University of Chicago. This brought together the leading thinkers like Harvey Wheeler, who wrote the book Feel Safe, people like Mircea Eliade, the famous comparative religionist from the University of Chicago, other thinkers and doers. And so I was there as a thinker in the realm of structuralism in Eastern philosophy. And then at the time, I had an opportunity to work with Dr. Thien Anh, who was a Vietnamese Buddhist scholar, as well as to teach at the State University of California in a variety of disciplines.
Was that at Northridge that you taught?
Right.
I taught there too for a semester while I was at UCSB. So how did you have time, Dr. H, to get 2 PhDs and a divinity degree?
I just was gifted with a deep interest in everything under the sun that dealt with futurism, and so I decided that I would get basically the degrees in what some thinkers would call the 4 quadrants, dealing with the inner micro universe of biology, psychology, physiology, and then the outer quadrant dealing with the macro universe in terms of physics, mathematics, cosmology, and theology. And so I had the opportunity to earn 2 PhDs from 2 major universities, and then I also received 2 honorary PhDs plus 2 master's degrees, which I will not go into because the idea is what you accomplish in life rather than what we would call the working papers that you need.
Right. Well, actually, I think he's an avid writer. So, and that's what it takes to write a dissertation or a thesis in that sense. So, and he really likes to put his ideas on paper. So it was not really that difficult for him to finalize all that academic work.
What age roughly were you by the time you'd finished the 2 PhDs and the theology degree?
Well, I started my theological training when I was quite young, in my late teens, but it took me approximately 25 years studying 4 major religions to really come up with a functional degree in the Oriental languages and theology, because our work was to translate ancient texts, which took considerable time. Desiree and I translated the Pistis Sophia documents of the 2nd and 3rd century AD, and these are all in ancient Greek and Coptic language. The 5 volumes run about 1,000 pages, and so this was a major undertaking.
And if you're not familiar with it, it's a well-accepted Coptic Christian text. Of course, this is aside from the Roman Catholics, they don't necessarily agree with it. And it also,
they don't agree with it because it explains the story of Jesus' female disciples.
Right, I was going to say. So it has Mary Magdalene, it has Martha talking. So it's very much what happened to Jesus. Actually, it's supposed to be after the resurrection, how he had seen other realms and came back and then talked with his disciples. But the male disciples were there as well.
I think it's the most important post-New Testament document available in early Christianity, and explains the Judaic traditions and the Oriental traditions that were there in the context of Jesus, who was a healer, a miracle worker, and also a visionary who understood that all of us have a path to the divine.
Before we go into your books, Desiree, what was your PhD in, and how did you learn those languages?
Okay, well, my master's from Syracuse in international relations, and my PhD from New School for Social Research and New School University, as they call it now, in environmental public policy. And I was here actually connected. We got connected very much with the United Nations in the environment. As I mentioned, I've been at CalArts studying environmental design and architecture. And so basically I just took that forward to how can countries and people make sure we are green, so to speak. And so that was what my dissertation was all about.
And is New School in the Bay Area?
No, it's in New York, and that's what also brought us to New York and with the United Nations. Yeah, so it has the various other institutes. Most people know them from the Actors Studio, which was there from New School, but they also have other policy institutes.
The roots of the new school go back to Frankfurt, Germany, with leading sociologists and thinkers in the 1930s who left Germany, came to the United States and set up a school of social thought dealing with questions on the nature of knowledge rather than subjects as such, emphasizing logic than the discipline of reflective thought and philosophy.
So they were doing epistemology.
Correct.
Okay, I want to get into all this, but first I want to do some of the kind of understanding the people who are doing this work. What have been the most difficult challenges in your life, and how have you coped, each of you?
Well, I'm considered a religious / spiritual philosopher. We were just at the World Parliament of Religions here in Toronto, Canada, which I've attended 5 times. I presented papers with Desiree. And so the challenge is to bring the spiritual and the scientific together, the two parts of the human experience. In simple language or poetic language, the spiritual represents the female side of the human mind, the multidimensional and creative side, the male more the logical, scientific, pragmatic side of the human creation. And so our work has been to resolve the dialectic between these two different traditions and the movements of thought, and to that end we publish widely both in scientific journals as well as in religious journals, and appeared and participate at major conferences dealing with world unity in religion and science.
And we feel we actually can bring it together, although it's pulling the dinosaurs with us, so to speak. But in actuality, with people like Russell Targ, who hopefully will be part of this work.
Yes, he is.
And the whole idea, we worked a lot with Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, who was from UC Berkeley, and also worked with Russell and Hal Puthoff back in the 70s for remote viewing. And her theory on quantum physics takes it onto literally another dimension. She calls it eighth space. And so when you go into those realities and you can see in remote view around the world, you realize that science through quantum physics is really, comes together as one, and there's no separation. There's actually no separation of anything.
Well, this is the big debate. There was a separation for 400 years in the West, and separation of religion from science, which was in somewhat a good thing in some ways, but also created a chasm as to how the mind works and visualizes and creates on multi-levels. And so there's a considerable entanglement or overview of these areas of creativity, or co-creativity might be the better word for it. So we've been looking at the history of thought in the European Near Eastern tradition as well as the Eastern tradition, and more recently with our studies in remote viewing and remote sensing, the possibilities that we are but one evolutionary experience in the midst of myriad evolutionary experiences in the definition of an open-ended cosmology.
Right. Dr. Hurtak wrote a book with Russell Targ called The End of Suffering, and the premise behind it is both quantum physics and Nagarjuna or Nagarjuna. People pronounce it different ways. And he's the one that says it's not black or white. It's actually black and white, and it's neither black nor white. So it's like going into all these alternatives, and that's really what we're seeing with quantum physics, is how it's neither a particle nor a wave, but yet we can affect it as the observer. And so we feel we're bringing it together. It's just a lot of people are still, in the Stone Age or the Dark Ages, as we call it.
So our religious and philosophical great minds that we connect with are Nagarjuna, who is considered the second Buddha by the Dalai Lama. We're interested in the writers of the sutras, of the Heart Sutra, for example, the Lotus Sutra in the Eastern tradition, and of course all of the prophets and mystics of the Western tradition, including Martin Buber, who was a great Hebrew scholar in the midst of the 1930s and 40s, during that period of what I would call the dark side of the human psyche. So we have had an opportunity to look at the mystical and, as we call it, the metaphysical side of science.
But I want readers to be able to identify with you as human beings. So my question is, what personally has been difficult for you in your life, and what got you through?
Well, unfortunately, we've had each other, so hopefully, and I should say we should give courses on marriage, I often think. But, so we have each other, and I think that the difficulties have always been just trying to convince others in what we have to say. And of course, he wrote his first book in 1973. And that was a pioneering book. I mean, it talks about pyramids when people didn't even understand what a pyramid was. Of
As
course,
well as zero-point energy, as well as the whole makeup of the genetic fabric is something that's connected
multi-universes, higher consciousness. Go ahead.
Well, there's a whole conceptual dictionary that's connected with the Keys of Enoch, which is
Okay,
basically a paraphysical textbook.
I want to get it. I want to have something that's personal so people can identify before we get into the kind of philosophical thinking.
But that is our life, and so I think you have to see that. Putting out this information in the 1970s was the challenge, and it was difficult at that point because most people said, "Oh, none of that is real. It's all kind of fake." But when you come out later, and this is what we call confirmations, in the 1990s, where NASA Goddard says the exact same thing, the sun is a variable star, then he wrote in his book in the 70s, you start getting through the problems that you've had. So we really haven't had, this problem or that problem. Of course, we'd love to have more money, maybe more friends, everything that everyone else wants. But what we really want and where our problems have been is getting the information out to people and getting them to understand the multi-level universe that we live in and how we're all interconnected and how we all make a difference in what we do. And you watch TV and you see the violence on TV and you realize, like Emoto, who we sponsored here.
Dr. Emoto from Japan, who we sponsored at the UN.
That you need to be careful of what you say to your children, because if you hate them or throw things at them or be negative to them, you're affecting their whole consciousness and their physical body through the power of the water. So, I mean, we're trying to get people awakened, and that's really been our struggle.
So to answer your question, Desiree and I felt the overemphasis on the culture of violence posed for us a great challenge, and why we were looking for answers for what I would say the raising of consciousness. And the direction we were searching in our early life was who could we relate to who would be interested in a culture of peace, a culture that would bring all traditions together on a higher level of meta language or language of language, providing inner experiences and resources that would go beyond the paradigms of traditional science, politics, and religion that were singular and self-serving, or more parochial rather than pluralistic. So we're very happy to say that things have moved very quickly now in the last 45 years, and we see a plethora of friends and colleagues in many disciplines who see the pluralistic model as opposed to the puristic model or parochial model of self-indulgence.
And I can just add one thing, and that's when Dr. Jack had a unique experience in 1973, he was told that this information, was avant-garde, and that eventually things would progress because this information was really given to humanity on the levels of genetics, on levels of astrophysics, on levels of history, archaeology, all that, but eventually people would come up to par. Now, he's kind of called the new normal in that sense, and it's come a long ways.
I want to hear about that, but first, as kind of an interesting footnote, if you were going to give a little short course on how to make a marriage work over time, what would you say? Because you've done it.
Be highly empathetic and highly forgiving. Be also aware of the limitations of the human psyche and seek a higher ground, a common ground for interchange between the states of creativity and the states of the heart.
And I'll leave it with that.
Well, why don't you add a woman's point of view? Because is it hard to have equality when you started out as professor-student?
Well, yeah. I mean, not so much the professor-student, but it took a while for me to, grow into. I did a radio show with him in the 1973, KOME, I think, it was called in San Jose. But, for me now we really teach and talk together all the time. So that took a bit growing into and for people to accept that. But people also appreciate the feminine aspect, and some people put them down. Well, the book is very masculine, and you can't do that when I'm part of that sharing. And the artist in the book, she wrote several pictures. She drew most of the colored plates. Was also feminine. So there's a lot of feminine there as well. It's not the masculine only. And he's always been very open to sharing, which is exciting and great.
So Desiree is arguing that one must look beyond the surface structure of language. One must go into the depth of language. And the linguistic components that we've emphasized in our work of retranslating many of these ancient texts is to bring in the female principle of co-creation, to bring in the worldwide participation of a multicultural approach as opposed to the singular European approach in many of the reinterpretation of text that we find in the 19th and 20th century.
And again, we know from your work, you understand that the feminine aspect has to balance the masculine for really the planet to find that inner balance and that greater peace.
Have you had a chance to have children along the way, or have you been too busy with books and...
Yeah, the kids are our books, or the books are our kids, whichever it goes.
Right, got it. Let's go into that experience in 1973. What was that?
I was meditating because as a young scholar, I felt I could not teach my students the concepts of spirituality, i.e., for example, the light manifestations, or what some would call the higher states of consciousness, without a similar experience. And so I began to use the combination of the seed syllables of various sacred pathways, for example, by combining the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the Greek and the Coptic, or the Greek and the Sanskrit languages. I felt that certain states of consciousness could be accelerated. And at one point, I opened what some would call a morphogenic door, a paraphysical reality where I was able to see a being of light. Some would argue a light being would be an angelic form or a higher teacher or spiritual guide. And I was taken into a greater realm of light. And from that point in 1973, my whole reality has changed to see really the divine spark that we all have, and the need to bring people into unity, not only through the different religious traditions that take the higher path of peace, nonviolence, and wisdom, but also higher unity in terms of science that sees the advantages of universal consciousness, the ability of using both locality and non-locality in the acquisition of information, as well as the ability to use the gifts we would call the paraphysical, the paranormal, in areas of reaching out with a better psychology and sociology for the advancement of the human race.
So did this kind of angelic-like creature provide you with the seed sounds, or is that something you used to get into the experience?
No, I was given, shall we say, a gift from the higher realms of intelligent life, in the sense of seeing and experiencing face-to-face an energy dialogue.
Yeah, no, her question was, no, he used the sacred expressions that he learned, because he was really working with both the Sanskrit, the Buddhist, the Hebrew, the Christian traditions, and he was using these sacred expressions prior to the experience, which is something that we use now, and we'll talk about that later. We encourage people to have their own experiences, of course. His was quite unique, where he was, we call it, and it's been called through history,
bilocation,
or a Merkaba experience, and Merkaba is used in the book itself, because that's really a vehicle that can take you beyond an extraterrestrial ship into, this is a multi-dimensional vehicle that can take you into other realms.
I think of Merkaba as sacred geometry. So,
yes, sacred geometry, not to be confused with a heavy metal UFO or extraterrestrial ship that the popular cultural advocates like to suggest is something that you have simply by clapping your hands or seeing things that you don't recognize.
But the Hebrew word or definition of the word Merkaba in English is vehicle. So it can be any vehicle in that sense. And of course, the traditionalists, the Kabbalists, always considered a higher vehicle that, like Ezekiel, could be taken into other realms. Daniel, or even Paul in the New Testament, was taken to the third heaven. Anyway, just as an example, that would be all classified as a Merkaba type experience.
So the idea, you were in meditation, you were using seed words like Om and whatever else, and then that led you to this transcendent experience.
That triggered a paraphysical experience.
And what kind of download of information did you get?
I received information covering a wide variety of subjects, 64
areas of science
that were futuristic, but also were reflections on historic places of the world where certain artifacts of knowledge would be found.
And information past, present, and future.
So in short language, it was a mental vision of archival information that I would be personally involved with over the rest of my life, and that has come to pass. In the last 45 years, we've worked in Egypt, we've worked in Japan, we've worked in other countries where we've uncovered
Mexico, of course,
archival information suggesting an earlier realm of an intelligent life on Mother Earth that was behind really the great myths and legends that we take on one level but dismiss on another as having no relevance for the human psyche.
So do you think that there were evolved beings who seeded Earth and taught early humans?
Yes, I do. I feel that the Greek and the ancient Hebrew concept of creation from a higher level is possible, and to that end, I've been involved in several documentaries and several explorations now underway to open up other areas of information. To that end, a new book will be coming out called the
Giza's Industrial Complex. So it shows how the ancient area of Egypt where the Great Pyramid is could have been a whole technology that is similar to what we're developing today in terms of hydrogen, oxygen, fuel cells, things like that.
So this is quite an explosive book. It opens really the minds of cultural historians and anthropologists to the fact that what the Egyptians call the golden age of the gods may be a reflection to a higher level of intelligent life that was there momentarily in the Middle East, or some type of scientific trade-off with other levels of cosmic intelligence and early Egyptian writers.
So that sounds like a huge download of information that covers the rest of your life. How did you remember it or record it, or that's just the mechanics of that?
Right. Well, when it's kind of like quantum physics and consciousness remote viewing. When you experience things like it's coded into your mind, and so there was actually 64, we'll say, writing pages. And then the rest was all information experiences, things he saw, like visual scenarios that he saw. And then he came back and he would actually do classes on each one of these 64 pages, so to speak, and talk about what was, what he saw related to that. And then that became transcribed into the Keys of Enoch. So it was a lot of visual scenarios and pictures, worth 1,000 words.
What's an example of one of the keys so people have a sense of what we're talking about?
We're talking about the alignment of the Great Pyramid with the belt of Orion. The star shafts in the Great Pyramids point specifically to, on one hand, to the circumpolar North Stars, and on the other hand, specifically to the stars we call the belt of Orion. In the Aramaic and Arabic, Mintaka, Anutak, and Anulam are these three major stars in the belt of Orion. This was pointed out in 1973 in the Keys of Enoch, later confirmed by Robert Lavelle and others working with him in 1993, who were able to take computers and go back in astrophysical time and show how the star shafts were indeed aligned with the stars in the belt of Orion, some 1,400 light years away from Mother Earth, through these star shafts that are very small, precise, and orientated through hundreds of meters of stone, suggesting that the Great Pyramid was an astrophysical gauge or computer of some sort to give these precise calculations.
So in other words, information came from those stars in Orion's belt that people could access through the pyramid?
Well, in practical language, the Great Pyramid was there in our terminology as an astrophysical computer showing the precession of the equinoxes, so that the ancient Egyptians and their predecessors, to some degree, were able to use a calendar cycle as well as an astronomical cycle built specifically on orientations which we now verify.
Right, so we didn't know that back in the 70s, but now we exist in the Milky Way. Everyone kind of knows that. But now they've labeled we exist in the Orion arm of the Milky Way. And not only did the Egyptians recognize Osiris connected with Orion, but now they recently found out in the Mayan culture, and this is through a woman named Linda Shelley, she has since passed away, that they, in the Mayan culture, recognized Orion as one of their god figures as well. So you have both in Mexico and in Egypt the significance of Orion. This is one of the key points that Dr. Hurtak felt. It's almost like a vortex or a portal to other realms. This is what he had experienced as well. So I know a lot of people talk about it, but you don't realize that so many places all around the world actually have certain alignments to Orion. So there could be some mythology that most people didn't recognize in the past.
Was this kind of connection associated with like intelligent entities? Like a lot of people talk about the Pleiadians or someone who've been helpful. So was this connection associated with intelligent guides?
Well, we actually are not into channeling or that kind of information. The Pleiades is also a significant place. Of course, there are many other star systems. We had a friend who had a connection with more earthly type beings, extraterrestrial types, that was connected with Alpha Centauri. She wrote about it in the 50s, and it turns out Alpha Centauri is our neighboring star. And, you know, there's no way she knew about that in the 50s, plus she was just a woman in the 50s. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. But basically, yeah, he was taken through certain levels really off the planet, and that's where and given physical scenarios, and actually his body was gone for a couple days. His students who were around him at the time, I knew him 3 months before his experience, but I wasn't with him at that moment. But he had other students who actually did lose him for a period of between 24 and 36 hours. So
when I came back, there was letter on my body that my students took pictures of for several weeks afterwards.
And we had many unique experiences around him during the rest of the year. It was January 2nd and 3rd, 1973, so we had at least to go to June to get out of school.
But I was very cautious in bringing this information forth because I did not want this to be venerated. At the same time, I wanted this information to be thoroughly researched. And we were trained really to do the field research with remote sensing, remote viewing, ground-penetrating radar, and other means of establishing what is called by geologists and physicists ground truth. So our work has taken an enormous amount of time in a variety of directions because you have 64 areas of science, of very complicated formulas that speak of things that are largely overlooked by cultural historians and theologians as to a blueprint for world civilization.
Did you say there were letters like on your body? I didn't understand what was on your body.
No, flame redders. Well, actually, when he was 16, he saw something unique, but otherwise, it was mostly fire letters that were seen in terms of some of the information. But basically, we tend to play down the actual experience itself. We'd rather come out with saying, you know, in the 70s, he wrote this book. This is what it says. It talks about multi-universes. It talks about multi-dimensional cosmologies.
It talks multiverse.
Yeah, multiverse.
And it also uses very unique information in terms such as zero-point energy that was really unknown at that time.
And pyramids, even pyramid energy was just becoming known. And it talks about the fact that, the civilization was much older than 6,000 years. And now, even in San Diego, they found mastodon bones, you might have heard about this, 120,000 years ago that had been logically placed together. That's now in a museum in San Diego, California. So, and they recently found a 170,000-year-old cave in France with Neanderthals making stone circles. So it's amazing what's come out, and really this all just confirms really what he saw. Now, the important thing is that he was told that this information is being shown to us so that we are ready for a quantum leap and change. And I come from an environmental background. The environment isn't doing that well. We have to be able to advance our technology to be able to literally grow into a new cosmology, as well as grow into the technology that we need to help ourselves on this planet. So we can't be stupid. We have to realize we need solar and wind energy. We need to advance ourselves consciously. So if we do see other realms of intelligence, we're prepared for that. And we need to understand our own genetic makeup.
We are also connected with the indigenous tradition because when we left academia, in some respect, it threw us into a deeper experience of world cultures. And so we represent 15 tribes from Brazil at the United Nations. We had an opportunity to dialogue with them over many years, also indigenous people in Africa, and we found that many of these tribes also refer to Orion as some sort of spiritual gateway or astrophysical threshold behind civilization as we define it. So
Well,
it's basically
what kind of intelligence is connected with Orion? I mean, is there a group of people, or is it an energy, or what is this? What's the manifestation of this connection to Orion?
well, we find it, for example, in the book of Job, referred to by Job as an area in the heavens that is part of the blueprint of physics as we know it.
Right, we find it as a portal, but what we would also say, which may answer your question, is that there's all the little green men, or we'd say the grays or the insectoid that people talk about with extraterrestrials. But we would say also we, as an Adamic species, and we'll put Eve in there too, we just call it Adamic species, is out there also in space. So that you would find us in Alpha Centauri, you will find us in the Pleiades connection, you will find us in the Orion connection, you find us in different places. And if you don't find us, you find our cosmic cousins that are also there. So some that look like us, tall whites, other types of intelligence.
So we're working on a biological textbook of these different categories, of which there are more than 70 that we've identified through our research with anthropologists, social scientists, shamans, and indigenous leaders that we've talked to in more than 30 countries.
So there are more than 70 types of ETs?
We're dealing with physical as well as non-physical.
Right. And so beyond the third and fourth dimension, as I mentioned with Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, is there's fifth dimensional realities, sixth, seventh, eighth. She even feels that remote viewing, as probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with, where you can see on other sides of the planet, is not going through the fourth dimension, which is time, but going through the eighth dimension, where space and time link together, and time, past, present, and future is there. So, who lives there? Is it just us being there in the eighth dimension, or are there other beings that function in those other dimensions? And who are the angels? And do angels actually, this is something I think is important to understand, in our cosmology, angels may exist in the 8th or 24th dimension, and like remote viewing or quantum physics, they don't have to leave the 24th dimension, walk down here, climb a little Jacob's ladder, and come here and say, hi, how are you? They put their consciousness linkage to who we are and where we are.
They would be called the extracelestials or the ultra-terrestrials as opposed to the physical extraterrestrials. So we have a large plethora of categories. Maybe it's easier, as we sometimes use the poetic expression, the cosmic others, to include representation from more than 70 different cultures, some of which are physical, others which are in energy form.
And so you know about these because of your own mystical communication and talking with shamans and how.
Well, also our work with astronauts that were retired and could talk openly to us about things that they experienced when they were in outer space. As you may or may not know, I work with Gordon Cooper, astronaut Gordon Cooper, who was a pioneer in space, saw space ships. And we worked with the famous American novelist Sidney Sheldon in a book that was published in the early 90s called The Doomsday Conspiracy, dealing with actual contact that the American government officials had with extraterrestrials, although this is written as science fiction. Clearly, Gordon Cooper and I both spoke at the United Nations, and we were talking to the Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim, as well as later Kofi Annan, about the need to have a space policy to accept the extraterrestrial hypothesis and to go beyond the scuttlebutt of what we will call the misinformed, who want simply one type of higher intelligence to land on the lawn of the White House. I should say White Horse in the theological sense. The land on the White Horse is going to come from space. No, we're looking at a orientation that all of humanity should be involved with. If we have contact with the other worlds of intelligence, it should come to the heart in the mind of advanced science, future science.
Right, but a lot of the cosmology initially, of course, came from Dr. Hurtak's experience. But now, if you look out there, and we didn't know this in the 70s, that there's trillions of stars, there's billions of
exoplanets,
of galaxies, and for every star we see now, and I just got this recently from someone connected with the University of Massachusetts, there's at least 5 to 7 planets, maybe as much as 10 planets around every star. And there's even planets that they call wandering planets that aren't even associated in the orbits, and there may be more wandering planets than there are planets around a star in orbit. So, I mean, it's vast out there. And even though no one wants to say life exists beyond the Earth, I mean, there isn't almost any astrophysicist nowadays that would ever tell you that there isn't some life somewhere. Even extremophiles doesn't have to, you know, most of them say, well, they couldn't get here or whatever.
The fact that there are extremophiles on Mars
or on here, no, on this,
would suggest there's extremophile situations that
possible extremophiles
that have been talked about seriously by anthropologists and astrophysicists. We know,
right?
So they don't have
came.
They don't have physical bodies like we know.
Well, okay. So first of all, he's talking about a meteorite that was found that came from Mars, and it looked like there was some sort of organic kind of life substances inside. So many of the scientists do feel that was enough confirmation that there's something probably even underneath the ground, maybe not on the surface of Mars. But, you know, in terms of life, it could be, like I said, looking like us, not looking like us, primitive life, advanced life, any multi-dimensional life. Certainly we've had legends, and we've actually had unique experiences all our lives since this experience of other levels of intelligence. We call them light beings. And even just, you mentioned in your interest of synchronicities, of how things just happen in life. And I think synchronicity is so important, and that people are starting to have synchronicities in their own life without any of these experiences. They could even plan this if they wanted to run into the guy on the subway or, you know, or whatever, wherever they are, a coffee shop, and it changes their whole life. So who's doing this? Where's this coming from? Is it just ourselves? We would say no. We actually recognize a higher divinity behind everything.
An intelligence.
So this is one discipline that we're involved with.
Hold on. Go ahead, Daryl.
If we were good, it seems to me that you would agree that our most pressing problem is the environment, and that we don't have much time to prevent global warming that will really fry us. So 0-point energy could be a solution, and people have invented 0-point energy devices that I think the big economic interests are not interested in. Do you think that 0-point energy can replace fossil fuels and help save us?
Well, we've actually worked in the energy field also since for the last 40 years. And I know you're in California, and we're also sometimes in California, and we got 2 fires going right now. So I don't know if, when you say fry us, I mean you're literally talking about down the street from you. Mm-hmm. But of course, you know, it could just really harm us.
I would say microwave radiation.
Yeah, and we need the technology to be able to change this and protect us, and to make different, you know, changes in our ability to handle these earth changes that are taking place. So we're not doomsdayers in that sense. But with that said, we've worked a lot with technology, and we've gone more with the hydrogen energy technology, which we recognize that probably the ancient Egyptians used as well. That because 0-point energy seems still, I know you say that people have done that, and we've worked with many people that have shown us models, but it's still a ways off. But certainly we need to change and get beyond our fossil fuels. And I have to say, it's not only the environment that's very destructive to us, because the more stress on the environment, the more violence also comes. And I even taught for a little bit as an adjunct at University of New York, SUNY Purchase, the State University. And I show my kids that basically when you have environmental crisis, you end up having political crisis. So I think it's very important to realize that all the people trying to come into Europe and the U.S., a lot of these people coming into Europe will starve if you don't bring them in. I mean, they literally will starve because there's no rain. So, I mean, you have...
In North Africa, we're talking about.
In North Africa, or in Central Africa as well.
So we're looking at a much larger picture.
But a more practical step-by-step.
And years ago, when I was director of TMAC, Technology Market Analysis Corporation in San Francisco, we bought literally thousands of engineers, scientists, and businessmen together in the 1980s to look at the possibility of a new approach through renewable energies, alternative energies, but the paradigms were not open enough to allow this great leap forward in science.
And right. So talk about the dinosaurs. But Dr. Hurtak, in his book, In the Keys of Enoch, actually uses the word 0 point energy. So we actually, or the 0 point, we know that it's a factor of being able to go beyond the local structure into more of a multidimensional reality of pulling in energy from these other realities through electromagnetic fields, probably. And so we're very familiar. But I think the next step has got to be hydrogen, and probably from water, even salt water. And
we're members of the Hydrogen Society. We know several specialists like Dr. Pesarugo at the University of Miami in Florida, who convene a lot of international conferences where we work with Russian, Chinese, and Japanese scientists who are looking at the hydrogen fuel cell.
What I've read about that is that it takes a lot of energy to create hydrogen fuel. So
that's right.
But there's different ways of doing it, and there's some very cheap fuel cells that haven't been coming out that should be. And I think we're going to see this by 2030. We'll probably, if it's not too late, seeing a lot of this coming. All you really need is solar energy, which
I wanted to see, because we have so little time, to emphasize, however, the greater breakthroughs are in consciousness. And this is our new book, Mind Dynamics in Space and Time with Elizabeth Rauscher. This is the emphasis we want to put on, because we're working in the mental realm, and we've recognized the power of mental communication with astronaut Mitchell in outer space, communicating back to our colleagues very discrete mathematical symbols, with the power of precognition, the power of being able to work through remote viewing, as we did with Elizabeth Rauscher, to find underground artifacts in Egypt and Syria. All of this opens up a whole new door, and I think we must use this time constructively to look at the new consciousness evolution that's taking place. That is the payoff that I think is so important in this conversation. So those of you who are interested, look at our work with Russell Targ, Elizabeth Rauscher, and even with Russian scientists, as well as Japanese scientists, in a book called Reflections on Life and Intelligence on Mother Earth. We published back in the early part of the 2006-2007 period, that deals with how leading scholars from all over the world are looking at the paraphysical door that's now being opened.
Right, so if you have consciousness and we realize we're all interconnected and what we think and what we do affects everybody around us, we start graduating into a more peaceful society, a more loving society, in which case we can start not being so worried about ourselves to figure out how to help the planet. And those that have tried to do this, like Elon Musk, who really, I mean, in a sense, he's kind of sacrificed his own life for all his, great ideas, SpaceX, Tesla, even now neural net, because neural lace, he thinks it's something needed for AI intelligence. I mean, he's able to then, help humanity in a great way. And we appreciate people like that who go beyond the individual I into the we. And that's what quantum physics is all about. It's that interconnectedness that we all share, or that entanglement that makes all of us part of one humanity.
So you're suggesting that we would be trained to access information through remote viewing and the paranormal to get answers to our problems.
Well, we know scientists in Silicon Valley who have used that, and they may call it inspiration, or they may have some sort of, message that comes to them, and they've been very successful. So, you have to test the waters. You can't do everything you think that comes into your head just because you think about it. But there's been some really good successes. Even Einstein actually used to meditate every morning, and we know this because he was in Palm Springs, and he used to visit the house where a friend of ours got later on in a purchase. And there was records about Einstein and pictures about Einstein and, and the places where he would meditate.
So the bottom line is consciousness is the variable for quantum transitions. The bottom line of the future is future science, science guided by consciousness.
And how do you define consciousness?
Well, consciousness, of course, is
the
field of energy the ancients would call the field of divine spirit, or the Holy Spirit, the whole field of the mental, the physical, and the spiritual operations and visionary inputs that take us into the reality of a multidimensional universe.
And if we want to sum it up, we would say Interstellar, the movie, is very much like what we're talking about. I mean, hopefully we don't have to go to the extreme that the whole planet was falling apart and they had to go to another world and she got communication from the fifth dimension. But we feel, that's the premise, that there are other cousins, cosmic cousins that are trying to help us, other divine realms of intelligence trying to give us the information to say, hey, stop it, wake up. If they came and just did it all for us, it wouldn't be practical.
So we are biotransducers for the universal mind. We're sparks of the divine in human form, waking up to the awesome powers of the universe. And we are a humanity that is graduating from the old paradigms of control of non-renewable resources into one where we will have free energy, free speech in terms of higher scientific and spiritual evolution, and ultimately, when we believe, cosmic contact with other civilizations that have gone beyond the quagmire of Mother Earth, that will show us the breakthroughs that we will need as we engineer new possibilities of life. That we are both in a divine and human partnership. We are
why are you optimistic in the face of Trump and the new Brazilian president and Putin and MS, whatever his name is, in Saudi Arabia? I mean, it looks like it's going down, not up.
Well, like Jesus, we say, let pay to Caesar what Caesar's. I mean, we don't get involved in politics. That's the one thing that he's kind of set up for our organization, not to get involved, because really there is also this higher energy that's trying to help us in many ways. So whether you have one last guy trying to, make some changes or not, or corrupt certain things, there's still each individual's choice in what they can do. And really it comes down to not only the collective, but the individual, where we want to see humanity go.
We are in a cosmic dialectic between formation and transformation, so there will always be those elements pulling down and those elements going upward. We place our emphasis on the positive. We like our audience to know at this time to think positive and to create a positive future by the way that you can use the gifts of inductive linkage, realizing that we are vessels and vehicles for the universal mind of the divine to experience the human dimension, and in partnership with the divine dimension to open new doors in spite of the dinosaurs that will have to die off and the old paradigms that will have to fall away.
So, for example, for 2012, when everyone was saying, oh, it's the end of the world, we were telling people, no, keep going. In fact, we did a conference in Cancun called Beyond 2012 on the Saturday and Sunday, because 2012 was the Friday. We had, thousands of people because everyone was down there. But the idea is that, we're living in a much more vast universe. We're part of a greater creation. And so, yes, we play out our stupid scenarios all the time. But ultimately, there's constantly that little push that moves us into a greater plan. And we do feel that this plan is a higher divine plan, and we're just part of it. We're learning, we're growing, and this is Schoolhouse Earth.
Well, what does your organization do? How is it funded? What does it emphasize? Where are you headed with that?
Well, we're the Academy for Future Science, and we're an international organization. And so we come out with publications in sometimes 20 different languages all over the world. And we work both in the environment as well as in consciousness understanding, as well as, we'll say, our philosophy of higher cosmology.
And we accept the UN Strategic Development Goals of raising consciousness, bringing women into science, helping people in developing countries to close the digital gap, and also to experience what we will consider a global commons, a place where people through the internet, like what we're doing right now, can open the doors to a positive future in spite of negative scenarios that come from a media that is entrenched in negative thinking or dualistic thinking that sees only tragedy rather than rebirth and realignment with the divine forces of creation. So we ask people to read and come to our website, keysofenoch.org.
Or futurescience.org.
And we have many films, many great music contributions that we have with leading singers throughout the world.
Right, because as Dr. Hurtak mentioned, he was inspired by singing the sacred name. So we have actually lots of music done by really great musicians, one of which just got the Certificate of Merit. Her name is Jocelyn Smith from the President of Germany for helping refugees coming in. And she was given
through music, which opens the heart of compassion. Through music, it opens up the higher mind to the universality of the message of humanity and the divine spark within all of life. So we want to open the door for all of our participants to realize that, we have a vast library of teaching that covers the scientific, the social, psychological, as well as the traditional spiritual that's raised to a new level of co-participation.
And we have individuals that study our work. We have web talks as well as different facilitators who look at the cosmology of science and also the ancient philosophy of the Godhead and put the two together, because I think that's in essence what we're talking about. There's really is no separation between past, present, and future, between science and religion. We are really all one higher cosmology of divine truth.
So were you both able to learn to do remote viewing as well as study it?
Well, Elizabeth Rauscher is far better than us, but we do it from time to time when it's not.
I used remote viewing back in the early 70s to actually see and publish the pyramidal formations on Mars, later accepted by NASA when they actually did the flybys with Mariner 9, and this was published in the Keys of England. We are the first really to break the story that there were pyramidal formations or structures on Mars, suggesting at one time possibly that there was a similar biosphere allowing intelligent life from one planet to interact with a sister planet. All of these things, of course, are in our book, and so we encourage our listeners to this program to go to the Keys and look at the confirmations that have been coming in our direction the last 40-some years.
So what do you do to get into the receptive space so you can do something like remote viewing or access higher information?
Well, the key to remote viewing, as Russell and Elizabeth and Hal will tell you, is that everyone can do it. Russell's very big on that because he didn't think he could do it initially until he had to do it because someone didn't show up, and he remote viewed Hal Pudolph down in Colombia in the country. South America. But it's really kind of quieting your mind, but then the very first thing that comes to your mind, and no intellectual or masculine, we could say, overlay to it. And, just even if it doesn't make sense to you, if you're seeing circles, like Uri Geller one time saw 2 circles and 2 lines out of it. Well, what he was remote viewing was glasses. And, of course, glasses do have the 2 circles and lines coming out. He didn't realize they were glasses. So, it doesn't have to make sense, and that's the key. And all of us do it all the time. And
so you just take a step beyond the traditional paradigm of location and logic that's built into that one location. You begin to work with all space. The whole horizon of knowledge then makes itself available to your mind.
And we were just with Rupert Sheldrake from England, and he says dogs and cats, and then there's even the psychic parrot here in New York that actually is able to remote view. So animals do it. We do it. I mean, the tribal people we've been with in the Amazon do it all the time. And they even, I won't say play with it, but they use it. If there's rain or if they need rain, they can actually work with the forces of nature to bring rain. And, we're taught none of that is real. We're taught all of it is false and we don't have that ability. But more and more people are starting to see. And I think the young people, and I'm really excited about this, they're having their own unique experiences. And then they come to the older people and say, well, what does this mean? And we can explain it to them. But they're actually remote viewing, and they're having, we'll say, experiences on other consciousness levels, and it's just natural for them.
What do you do to renew yourself in the face of all this work? What do you do for fun?
We meditate twice a day, in the morning and the evening. I think meditation is a suggestion and a methodology that we would like all people to do in their own way, whether it's silent or with music or with good ideas. And focusing on the trouble spots of Mother Earth, realizing we're here to heal the divisions and come up with answers that may differ, but essentially, in essence, I should say, we are all being here in Schoolhouse Mother Earth for the lessons and the challenges that brought us into incarnation. And as we solve these problems, we believe we will graduate as cosmic citizens and ultimately work in the University of the Cosmos.
And I just want to say for all of our listeners that meditation is important for everyone. And it could be prayer, whatever you want to do. It can be different forms of meditation. But basically, even if you're just quiet for a little bit and you align yourself, we'll say, with the greater cosmos, that allows even the cells inside your body to really take a moment and breathe, so to speak, and relax and go back to the alignment. Because we're exposed here and we're getting 5G networks and we're getting all this other Wi-Fi things that are happening. We need to take that time to allow our body, our mind, and we would say also our soul spirit to align on a regular basis. Otherwise, we're going to be caught in the chaos. And there is going to be chaos when, more and more climate change and other activities take place.
What else do you do for fun?
I saw that.
Fun is in service to humanity. That's the fun. It's combining vocation, avocation, hobby, where you embrace the world in a real sense, and you feel the heartbeat of children in Africa and South America, or you feel the challenge of people who still have hostility to overcome, where you can show them, for example, textbooks that we've done with the American scientists, or for that matter with anthropologists in Egypt and Latin America, to show that we have answers for these historic questions or chasms or areas of ignorance. No, we're all interconnected. And the further we push the envelope back in history, we see the artifacts that there was a much higher positive cosmology. As we open the front door to the future and push the envelope, we see we have the possibilities of space civilization working really with profound ultra-terrestrial forces of intelligence. So it's a win-win situation that we must keep alive within our heart.
Do you have a few more minutes to talk about specific books?
Yes.
Okay.
I would like to recommend, we have a book called The Overself Awakening, which looks at the traditional philosophies and psychologies of world cultures, showing the methodology of opening the human psyche through the female imagery.
Right, it's actually more of a personal phase of graduation, so it goes through 72 phases of what most people do in waking up to their higher consciousness. It's called the Overself Awakening.
Feeling the divine mothering aspect, the psyche we all have that can think and work multidimensionally.
And then we mentioned the Pistis Sophia, which is
like 5 volumes dealing with the teaching.
But wait, how do you access it? This feminine
online.
Yeah, some of them is available through Amazon and some through our website keysofenoch.org. But so Pistis Sophia is a 900-page book because it goes back into this ancient scroll. And then we do commentary on it. So we have both the scroll and then our commentary. That's how we handle most of it. And there's also the Gospel of Mary, which, as you may know, is the Mary Magdalene. That was also found in the Coptic literature. And so that's a much smaller book. It's kind of just a very brief overview of some of the philosophy that we've been talking about today.
And then we have a book called Consciousness, Energy and Future Science, articles by Robert Schoch and myself,
and many other authors.
Many other authors showing the interface between consciousness and science.
And then Mind Dynamics. Do you have a copy of Mind Dynamics here?
I have it in the other library.
Okay. Mind Dynamics in Space and Time, our most recent book with Elizabeth Rauscher. So, and it talks about her work with the remote viewing in the 70s, her philosophy and science is in the middle of the book, and then our work at the end of the book that we did remote viewing with her in 2012, 2013 in different parts of the world, and also then some of our own philosophy on remote viewing.
But we'd also like to emphasize our films called the Merkaba and also Light Body, which gives the person who watches the film an experience of swimming in hyperspace or being able to go into the different dimensions through different scenarios of sacred geometry, color, and historic reality.
And then all our music. We have great music from the Western tradition, the Eastern tradition, to just music.
Having worked with Alice Coltrane, having worked with Carlos Santana, having worked with Jocelyn Smith, some of the great musicians of our contemporary society who have also had higher consciousness awakening and understand spirituality to be something that is part of our birthright, that we are human, but we are also meta-human and cosmic human.
What kind of insights came out from the studies of Sophia and Mary Magdalene that if they had been integrated into the development of Christianity would have made it different?
Well, one aspect I would like to emphasize is the African church and the Eastern church never marginalized the female as much as we see in the Western Catholic and Protestant church. The female concept of Sophia, or in the Hebrew, the word Hokmah, was associated with wisdom and in some instances even with the work of the Holy Spirit. So the first 3 centuries of Christianity, before Christianity became politicized by the Roman Empire, were very open and charismatic, and that's why you have so many miracles taking place in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. After Christianity, in my opinion, becomes dogmatized and politicized, the love element is lost, the divine female nature of co-participation with the divine spirit or Holy Spirit is lost, and the emphasis is upon the lower hierarchy rather than the cosmic angelic hierarchy, which I feel is the ultra-terrestrial dimension that's missing from science and spirituality. So we need a deeper spirituality and a new science to integrate and to see that we are on a much larger journey that the blueprint of higher evolution provides.
What did you talk about space law, and maybe an explanation for the quantum information field is the macro within the micro? Could you comment about space law?
Well, Desiree and I are also members of various groups working with the late space lawyer Declan O'Donnell from Colorado, Denver, Colorado, and we've had publications in several law reviews and aerospace journals dealing with the need that we need not only a global ethic, but we need a space ethic.
Oh.
So we don't commercialize space or have weapons of mass destruction in space. And to that end, we work with astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who before he died put forth a treaty on space law.
Right, with Carol Rosin, who's a very good friend of ours. And her whole concept is the fact that we have to really keep our weapons of war out of space. And so we need to have some serious treaties. You know, most of our space law treaties at the United Nations go back to 1967. There's a little bit in the 70s. But most things haven't kept up because, you know, and those are usually with governments. So our government is getting around it, going to exploit, we'll say, asteroids because it's a company doing it. It's not the government. And so only the governments had signed about governments not doing things. Corporations can do what they want as far as most countries are concerned.
So we co-authored a book with a lawyer in Brasilia, in the country of Brazil, called Space Law. It's in Portuguese. Unfortunately, it will be translated into English, that deals with the norms that we must keep in mind as we go to our sister planets, so we'll not destroy those planetary resources and environments, but also draw from them the needed energy that we will need to build our civilization in space.
And I would just say, in terms of within and without, we see everything as being, you mentioned Merkaba sacred geometry, of course, really what is above and out there and around us is the same as what is within us. And the Mayans talked about Ixtacalnuc. They had the lady cloth weaver also in the North American Indians. So they saw the whole star patterns of the heavens as being part of a certain alignment. It's not random. It's not a big bang. And some scientists are starting to recognize that there's a patterning. And that patterning is seen in the Fibonacci golden mean section of our hands, of our body, you know, all aspects of our ear. If anyone's ever seen the cochlea, it's actually the spiral, just like, you know, the Fibonacci or a golden mean. So we're all interconnected. All of geometry, all of life is interconnected.
So we've illustrated this in the book called The 72 Divine Names of the Divine Mother. And that book is available as a linguistic text, as well as an anthropological study of sacred language and sacred geometry from 12 major cultures of the world. We want to thank you once again for allowing us to have this conversation with you, touching so many subjects. But again, we feel this is so important that we will have a line of information, a worldwide network of new ideas and new directions so that we can see the higher joy of life. This is so special, and we want to thank you once again, Gail, for having us on as your correspondents and your new friends.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. I will